right. Well, it is such a joy to be the opening act for Pete Enns. Story of my life. Oh, it's so good to see all of you and see your faces. I don't do this a whole lot anymore. I used to travel and speak and be on the road a wee bit more. And I don't really do this a whole lot anymore. I'm now just a pseudo-hermit bookworm at home primarily. And so I do miss my soft pants. And so what I've decided to do instead is wear a dress that basically is like masquerading as a blanket, and I get to wear my Doc Martens, and what a time to be alive. This is just a good time to be here. So I thought that I would take a couple of minutes and I guess maybe just introduce myself for those of you who were dragged here by someone whom you're not entirely sure was trustworthy. So hi, I'm Sarah. And I am from Calgary, Alberta, which is in the Rocky Mountains. I don't know if any of you have watched a documentary about Banff, but that's basically our backyard. And so that's where we are. I've got 4 kids. We had our first 3 kids in 4 years, and now they are all teenagers. I married a Nebraskan, and he looks corn-fed. He looks like what he is. People see him on the street and they're like, Nebraska? And he's like, yep, that's what he is. And so he's like 6'6", and so my son is only 15 and he's 6'4" already. And so we've got 3 teenagers. My eldest is graduating high school this year. I had this moment. We were at one of those, like, I don't know if you that have launched kids have done like the university fairs, like where you go and you get all the information from the attainment of higher education, apparently. I wouldn't know. I went to Oral Roberts University. I don't mention it. And so there's this thing, though, we were standing there and we were getting her packet of information for the university, and all of a sudden I looked up at her. She's 6 foot. And I looked up at her and I was like, that was it. That was your childhood. I guess that was it. So I'm doing great, is where I'm getting with that. So she's in grade 12, Joe's in grade 10, and then we have our 13-year-old Evelyn, who's in grade 7, and she just joined the wrestling team, and she is kicking tail. She did break her wrist. It's fine. And then we have one last little one who surprised us along the way, best surprise ever. Her name is Margaret. And my kids unironically called her Princess Margaret for the first 5 years of her life, which basically everything you've ever heard about youngest children is true in my house. And so that's just our reality. We've also got 2 cats that are named after Doctor Who companions. Their names are Amy and Rory. And so, yeah, that's our household. It's a little bit busy. And in addition to my work as a writer, I also have the opportunity to help shepherd and lead the Evolving Faith community, which is for a lot of folks, I imagine, like who you all are, people who have kind of run out of answers or found themselves at a place of crossroad. We often use the metaphors of wilderness when it comes to our faith, where you do feel like anything that resembled certainty and security is gone. And oftentimes it has this feeling of almost a threshold. And some of us cross that threshold because of theological reasons. Some of us cross it because of scriptural reasons, or because of feeling very politically homeless, or feeling like we're looking at oftentimes the churches of our that have formed us and shaped us and being like, I think you people are broken. And then also there's this sense of like disorientation and loneliness to it. There's also a bit of grief to it. Some of us feel like we didn't so much as cross that threshold as we were thrown over it, body and soul, whether we liked it or not, and we fought it kicking and screaming the whole way. And so what ends up happening when you find yourself in that space is it does feel really lonely. And then all of a sudden we kind of slowly start to find each other. And we start to realize there's a couple of different options that we can have when we have these moments in our lives that happen, which, by the way, are entirely normal and entirely expected. I think that if you haven't had that experience yet, you will. But also, I think that if you haven't had it, maybe, I don't know, there's a lot of invitations. There are a lot of invitations. And for a long time, I was someone who wanted to ignore every invitation that I felt like the Spirit was giving me to cross that threshold. And yet, here we all are. on the other side of that. So I wanted to take some time tonight to talk about hope, which feels very ill-advised right now. Foolish even. I walked in and I saw all of you fine people and I was like, well, I regret this. Pretty much every choice that has led me here, says the introvert. So one thing about me that you may have missed when I was talking about where I went to school is I came up in the charismatic movement and was deeply formed by the prosperity gospel and by the word of faith movements. And so being Canadian, my story around religion is oftentimes a little bit different than a lot of Americans I know. And so I don't make the assumption that a lot of you share this same story. But in my context and where I grew up, it wasn't my generation that was questioning the church or about the church's role in public life. It wasn't my parents' generation. It wasn't even my grandparents' generation. My great-grandparents were the last people who were in church or had any sort of like religious affiliation. By the time my parents and I and my sister came to faith, we were first-generation Christians, and it did have the experience of flipping almost everything in our lives upside down. We'd had no idea that Presbyterians existed. We did not know where we fit in the larger stories of the church. We were first-generation believers. We met in, for me, church smells more like the chlorine at the leisure center pool because we got the meeting room at a discount than it does smell like smells and bells, right? Like we were more likely to have dueling tambourines in the room than icons. And it's kind of like this offshoot sort of like American Pentecostalism, but not really. And also we're Canadian, so I don't know. There was sometimes some weirdness in the 80s. It's a whole long story. But there was this disorientation for me of feeling like if this is what it means, is this small of a box around hope and around love and around how we show up in the world, if I don't do this, then maybe I don't get to be a Christian anymore. And it had been everything to me. I don't know if you've noticed, but I'm terrifyingly earnest and very sincere. Imagine me at 12. Like, it was a situation. There was no higher honor in my life than being the girl who was allowed to work the projector for the 17 times we sang the chorus. It was amazing. And one of the things that ended up happening for me when I began to sort of disentangle my faith, which sounds a lot nicer to me than what actually is how it felt, which is like a total destruction of everything I thought I knew about God. And everything I thought I knew about myself, everything I thought I knew about how we move through the world. There's a lot of grief to that. And there's a lot of fear about it. And you don't only have the fear in your own heart and in your own life, but the people around you often are very afraid for you. And they are afraid of you. And that, I don't want to spoil it for you, is not helpful. And I remember having this moment really early in my process of feeling like I was losing everything. And I remember my dad coming to me and saying something along the lines of, acknowledging how costly it had been. It cost my husband his vocation, cost us our work, cost us friends and community and churches. And it just felt like the losses kept accumulating, and I felt like I was in the center of everything that was wrong. And I remember my dad coming to me and saying very gently that he believed sincerely that I was seeking God. And that if I was seeking God, I would find God, even if it looked very different than what he had found. And that just was like this exhale that I needed. Just this almost sense of permission that maybe God was bigger. And maybe the story was wider, and maybe even then possibly there might still be room for me in the midst of all of it, even if I was kicking over every edifice I'd ever built for God. And so one of the things that has helped me, that has surprised me all these years later, is how much I love Jesus. still got stars in my eyes about Jesus. I love my Bible, even though I read it so differently than I used to. Thanks for nothing. This guy. And so it will surprise probably none of you then to know that where I want to begin tonight is with a story that involves Jesus. The story takes place on the third day after Jesus' trial and crucifixion and the burial. And what has happened is the women who are grieving have shown up at the tomb, and they have realized that it's empty. They were carrying all of their burial spices. They encounter an angel who tells them that Jesus has been raised from the dead. Mary Magdalene's among these women. So of course they immediately run back to the 11 and all the other disciples who are there to tell them about this, but brace yourself for a shock, nobody believed the women. Imagine that. And so finally Peter goes to check it out and verify, and sure enough, he finds the tomb empty, but there's no angels, and he's left wondering. And so it's after that that we encounter two other disciples who have heard about Jesus' resurrection from the women who were at the tomb. But they're on the road to Emmaus. They're heading home. If you aren't familiar with the story, it's over in Luke 24, and that's where I want to pick up our story. So again, I had warned you already that I'm from like kind of a Pentecostal adjacent background. It might get preachy. I did make a promise that I would not go over like an hour. It's cute, you think I'm kidding. All right, so here we are. It says, now the same day, two of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem. They were talking with each other about everything that had happened. As they talked and discussed these things with each other, Jesus himself came up and walked along with them, but they were kept from recognizing him. He asked them, what are you discussing together as you walk along? I find Jesus hilarious sometimes. And so they stood still, their faces downcast. One of them, named Cleopas, asked him, are you the only one visiting Jerusalem who does not know the things that have happened there in these days? What things? He asked. This guy. About Jesus of Nazareth, they replied. He was a prophet, powerful in word and deed before God and all the people. The chief priests and our rulers handed him over to be sentenced to death, and they crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one who was going to redeem Israel. And what is more, it is the third day since all this took place. In addition, some of our women amazed us. They went to the tomb early this morning but didn't find his body. They came and told us that they had seen a vision of angels who said he was alive. Then some of our companions went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but they did not see Jesus. He said to them, how foolish you are, and how slow to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Did not the Messiah have to suffer these things and then enter into his glory? And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he explained to them what was said in the scriptures concerning himself. As they approached the village to which they were going, Jesus continued on as if he were going farther. But they urged him strongly, stay with us, for it is nearly evening and the day is almost over. So he went in to stay with them. When he was at the table with them, he took bread, gave thanks, broke it, and began to give it to them. Then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him. And what does this guy do? He disappeared from their sight. They asked each other, were not our hearts burning within us while he talked with us on the road and opened the scriptures to us? They got up and returned at once to Jerusalem. There they found the 11 and those with them, assembled together and said, it's true. The Lord has risen and has appeared to Simon. And then these two told what had happened on the way and how Jesus was recognized by them when he broke the bread. There's a million things and a million places you can jump in on here. But there is one phrase in here that in the midst of, I don't know if I love the phrase deconstruction. It implies something a lot tidier than what I experienced. But there was a phrase in there that I recognized, and it sort of broke my heart. I think because I I felt that. And it's right there when Cleopas says those words to Jesus, and then the companion, I almost can see them like nodding along. And he says, the chief priests and our rulers handed him over to be sentenced to death, and they crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one who was going to redeem Israel. And that was them. Those were the three words that broke my heart. We had hoped. That we had hoped. We don't really know, but maybe they had hoped that Jesus would redeem Israel, and maybe they had hoped that he would be their great liberator. Maybe that he was the Messiah that they had been longing for, and now the math didn't quite work out for them. They had hoped for more great words and deeds. They had hoped to maybe overthrow the Romans. They had hoped for redemption. Maybe some part of them was hoping he would find a way to talk himself out of this one, because he kind of did that sometimes. That they had hoped perhaps that triumphal entry meant something. That maybe Jesus would be alive, but he's dead, and his body's missing, and we've got these wild stories happening, and now what? And so they're headed home. In his commentary on the book of Luke, Justo L. Gonzalez notes that even the possibility of resurrection isn't enough to wipe away their sadness. Even the possibility of resurrection. That they are disappointed because not just because they expected certain things out of Jesus, but they're sad because he hasn't met that expectation. They're not just sad because he's dead. We had hoped. And to me, I feel like that is the wilderness that many of us are experiencing right now at this moment in time. Absolutely, there's anger. And for sure, I feel a growing sense of betrayal from a lot of people that I talk to. There's a lot of grief, there's fear, and there's sorrow. But there is such profound disappointment. There's just this, thwarted, choking kind of disappointment. Very famously, Proverbs tells us that hope deferred makes the heart sick, but a longing fulfilled is a tree of life. And I think that's maybe what I was hearing in those three words. It's heart sickness, that we had hoped. And when you write a book like this, the last one that I just had come out, but also when you lead spaces like Evolving Faith, with people who often are coming into communities like this with a lot of wounds and a lot of heaviness and stories that honestly I will carry forever. I see this. We had hoped. We had hoped for so many things. We had hoped that the people who introduced us to Jesus would not be deceived by Christian nationalism and conspiracy theories. That we had hoped our marriages would survive our evolution and transformation. We had hoped for healing that never happened. We had hoped that our friendships maybe could survive even as we changed. We had hoped that the church would love our gay kids and our trans neighbors and the immigrants and the widows and the poor and the incarcerated and disabled. We had hoped that being queer wouldn't stop our denomination from ordaining us, let alone seeing us as being made in the image of God. We had hoped that if we raised our kids a certain way, we could guarantee an outcome. As a parent of teenagers, I can tell you that's crap. Turns out. We had hoped that when we came forward with a story of being abused within the church, that we would be believed, cared for, instead of blamed, re-traumatized. We had hoped that purity culture would give us a healthy view of sex, but boy, what a nightmare that turned out to be. We had hoped that our parents would love us unconditionally. There are a lot of people who have learned there's a limit. We had hoped that the church that claims to be pro-life wouldn't also be pro-gun, pro-war, pro-death penalty, and anti-refugee. We had hoped that our elders would be who they taught us to be. We had hoped that our lives maybe would look different than they do. We had hoped our prayers would be answered in an ICU in Nashville. We had hoped that we could ask our biggest, scariest questions without making people call us heretics or dangerous or accuse us of disobedience and faithlessness or a yearning to fornicate. Aforementioned purity culture. We had hoped that we could bring our whole self to church. We had hoped the gospel might actually be good news and glad tidings for everyone. We had hoped for justice. We had hoped for so many things. You know, there's a song about the road to Emmaus, and the artist wrote these 2 lines. It said, the two fools on the road to Emmaus, they might as well be you and me. Maybe we haven't even admitted yet how heartsick and disappointed we are. It's wrapped up in this shroud of anger and bitterness and resentment and frustration and betrayal. But we are profoundly and deeply, devastatingly disappointed. And maybe Jesus hasn't met your expectations, but maybe it's simply those who claim to follow Jesus. I do think, for what it's worth, that it is actually good and worthy work to interrogate our expectations of Jesus, right? To really peek under what that might be, because sometimes we are more like the disciples who expected one particular type of Messiah and wound up with the crucified Lamb of God instead. And so I think it's worthwhile to interrogate some of the expectations we have. Sometimes those expectations need to be disappointed in order to make room for the wise and true and good gospel to actually disrupt us and to flourish. Sometimes you have to do so much work unlearning things in order to have even space to relearn the goodness and the truth and the welcome and beauty of God. So maybe you feel that disappointment. Maybe you don't, and you never have before, and that is fine too. I promise, listen, I know a lot of us find ourselves there at some point, and so if today's not your day, congratulations. I didn't mean that quite as sarcastically as it came out. Genuinely, congratulations. How does that sound better? But if that's the case and it's not your story, you just can tuck this one in the back pocket. You'll encounter someone who does feel this way. Maybe if you need it, you can trust that the Spirit will pull that out for you on a day when you do need to be reminded of it, right? Because we each have a different story. We are all at different moments in our journeys, blah, blah, blah. I wouldn't be a progressive faith leader if I didn't use the word journey at least twice tonight. I had to check in my black chunky glasses after 2013, so. One of the biggest lies that I often have heard about people like us who find themselves in the wilderness is that if we were more faithful, we would not have found ourselves here. I believe with my whole heart that you found yourself here not because of faithlessness, but because of faithfulness. You were often the true believer kid. You were the one who had the expectations. You were the one who was all in on every good thing you ever heard about this and wanted to believe it. And so I want to bless that. I think that's worth blessing. That you were someone who dared to hope. That you took it seriously. That you dared to hope that the gospel was true. That you dared to hope that Jesus was who he said he was. And that God is actually love. You dared to believe that the church could be a sanctuary for the wounded and the marginalized and all of us misfits. You dared to hope that maybe we are all made in the image of God. And you dared to hope that prayer changed things. You dared to hope that you would be loved and that you could love people in return. You dared to hope that Jesus' teachings and way of life would matter more than politics or power, or that truth and goodness mattered. You dared to hope for friendship and for justice and belonging. You dared to hope and contend for peace. And so here we are, all those fools on the road to Emmaus, bringing our heart sickness and our disappointment with us, that we've heard of resurrection, but we aren't even sure what that means yet, or if we believe it. And yet, were not our hearts strangely warmed when we were on the road, they asked later. Maybe we might ask ourselves that. Maybe. My friend Rachel used to always use the phrase, on the days when I believe this. I have always loved it. I think for the honesty of it. I don't think enough of us are honest about the fact that there are days when maybe we don't believe it. It just sounds better if you don't say it out loud. And so, on the days when I believe this, right on the road, in the middle of our despair and in the dust of our disappointments, I do believe we are walking with Jesus in ways that we cannot even recognize yet. And one of the things that I find really interesting, I think especially because I came from the prosperity gospel, word of faith, some of you may know it as the name it and claim it corner of the church. We were not sick, we were coming down with a healing. Wish I was kidding about that one. But it has always struck me that these two disciples were not afraid to say out loud, even to this stranger on the road, the reality of their situation and their feelings, that they weren't afraid to admit that they were sad and that they were disappointed, that their hopes had not come to fruition in the way that they expected, that they were confused, and they did not pray that away or pretend it away or pray it away or sing very victorious worship songs. Well, anyway. I think we can grieve the friends that we've lost and the dreams that have died and the ideas that have become bitter reality. You're allowed to say it out loud. You are. You're allowed to say that you were disappointed and that there's a gap between what you hoped for and what turned out to be true. We can say that the women tell me there's resurrection, but I'm not sure what I believe right now. And there will be people around you who will say you've walked away from Jesus, but here he is on the road out of town with you. We don't always recognize him. And as they walked on that road, Jesus spoke to them about how his suffering was part of the story, and he speaks to them about the scriptures and the prophets and the path that led him there, even to that moment with them. And so their hearts are warming and they're kind of rekindling a very unlikely hope even before they can name it. Even before they recognize him, they can feel it sort of dawning. So I wonder if there's room, if not for resurrection yet, then maybe for the companionship and the guidance of God as you travel. That you can be walking with Jesus, feeling like your hope is dead the whole time. God is alive and walking alongside of you with patience and kindness and love, kilometer by kilometer, hour by hour. And I know that I do go on quite a lot about hope and love. Talk about it in chapel on Wednesday too, so lucky you. And it is on purpose. It's not a naive thing for me. It's not empty or like some fast pass out of discomfort. I have found and contended for that hope. And I know that there are people here who have done that work. It's because you've suffered and you've grieved. We've had our certainties blown to hell. And to be honest with you, it turned out God was the one who lit the match. And the God who suffered is the same God that is calling us to hope. And so your defiant, scrappy little bit of hope that you still hold and that you are tending like a campfire in the dead of night tells me you are not done yet. The fact that you're even here tells me that some little pilot light of hope is still lit in the furnace of you. And I am not talking about the stupidity of silver linings. I think my spiritual gift could be pretending to be fine, except I really am gifted at passive aggression. I can kind of go both ways. So this is not that. I wish it was. My sister always jokes with me that at the point of my demise and she is picking up my epitaph for my headstone, it will either say, I'm fine, it's fine, everything's fine, or it will say, in another month or two, things will settle down. Either one's a winner. So this is not that. It's not the violence of everything happens for a reason, or a very privileged optimism because it's always worked out for you before because I'm a nice white straight lady. And I'm not talking about the anemic idea of pretending that everything's fine, or even that yay for heaven kind of notion of like, sure, it sucks now, but I'm just going to hang in there. I'm not talking about toxic positivity. I see something so different in Jesus. And it's not just Jesus in this story, but in the entirety of Jesus' life and ministry and ongoing work in the world today, and the ongoing and entire story of Scripture, even in my own bonkers life, which should not be an example to anybody. And when I look at Christian hope, I see a hope that is taking suffering and grief and injustice seriously, that takes our liberation and our joy and our flourishing seriously, that this isn't dismissive or pat on the head platitudes. We're not living and moving and having our being in a love that denies our full humanity. And your hope is defiant. However small that light is, it is resistance. As Presbyterian Church, I'm sure this is fine. It's like this middle finger to the forces that seek to colonize and steal, kill, and destroy us. It is this knowledge that Jesus came to give life, and life that is more abundant. And that does not mean faking it till you make it. And you would not have found yourself even here in the wilderness if it wasn't for your hope. Your hope is rooted in your grief. It is rooted in your anger and in your despair and in your sense of betrayal, in your suffering. But it is also rooted in everything that you love. It is rooted in the sight of the freckles on your kid's face and the way that you love the light at golden hour. All of those things are where your hope is rooted, and you won it. You have worked for it, and you earned it. Your hope deserves your honor and your love. Your hope is turning over tables in the temple. Your hope is why you're voting and marching and protesting, or as John Lewis used to say, making good trouble. Your hope is never giving up and never backing down. Your hope isn't sit down and shut up. Your hope shows up for the lonely and the needy and the sick and the stranger. Your hope notices and prioritizes beauty and joy and makes room for rest and Sabbath. Your hope is singing songs and cooking meals and braiding your kids' hair and writing poems you hope nobody ever finds. Your hope is planting gardens in the very places of your exile. Your hope is building an oasis for every other misfit who wanders by. Your hope is what brought you here. Your hope is what helps you know that you are not alone. And maybe it is not the optimism and naivety of your old life. I know it doesn't feel like it right now, but it is a mercy. Because this is hope that has seen a few things. Now you are good friends with hope that has lines on her face and silver in her hair. Hope with strong arms and steady feet that are planted and rooted in the love of God. Hope with a raised fist. Hope that is crying out in the streets. Hope that is feeding the hungry. And hope with bruises on her knuckles and fire in her eyes. This is hope that fully shows up, knowing already that she will be disappointed again, and even that knowledge doesn't scare her. This is your hope that keeps you rising every morning and making the coffee and keep freaking going. Jesus on the road is the living embodiment of what we are yearning for here. That deferred hopes and disappointment, that grief and sorrow, that suffering and longing is not the end. They're real, and they're not the last word, the biggest word or the only word. That love that your hope is pointing you towards is more real than anything. And it turns out on the road out of town, Jesus is waiting at the crossroad. So don't surrender your hope just yet. Don't let them take it from you. I think you can contend for it. There's an old churchy word I still love. You can contend for your hope. You can bring it with you on the road. You can tend to it even as you leave behind toxic beliefs and habits and spaces maybe that don't bring flourishing to you or to the world. I remember Rach used to say that an evolving faith isn't one that's superior or further along. It's just faith that has adapted in order to survive. And that's basically what's happening. Hope is like that too. You can let it adapt. You can let it change in order to survive. And the thing I love about this is that it doesn't disappoint us in the end. That our hope in the goodness and the welcome and the love of God, you wonderful, stubborn people, it's not going to disappoint you. That you can take a risk on hope again. That longing fulfilled is that tree of life. And Revelation tells us that tree of life, its leaves are for the healing of the nations and the renewal of all things. And so, we're still walking towards Emmaus. Our hope is with us. And maybe our eyes will be opened to who is walking us home all along. I want to bless you before Pete comes up for us to chat. I knew I should have packed my flags. Now, may the God of Emmaus and all disappointed disciples meet with you on this journey. And if you think I'm talking to you, I am. May you acknowledge and bless your heart sickness and your confusion and your grief and your anger as holy and as an invitation from God. May you tend that little spark of hope that is strangely warming in your heart and treat it with honor and love. May you learn to integrate telling the truth with hope. May you learn to love your broken heart. Every stitch of mending will be there on purpose. And I pray for audacious hopefulness, one that takes suffering and loss as seriously as love and faith. And I already know that most of you are not in any danger of glamorizing hope. You understand that grit in the teeth nature of it probably a bit too well. And so when you are most windblown and filthy, when you lift up your head again and again, I pray that there would be that smart aleck grin on your face. May you know the companionship and guidance of the stars and of the Spirit as you travel through your loneliest places. And may you trust that even now you are held in the love that holds everything. Amen. All right, Pete, I'm going to come cause some trouble.
Where do you want to go?
All righty. It's a fancy pulpit. It's got wheels.
It's got wheels. All right, so two things as we begin here. I've done a lot of horrible things in my life. I've never flipped anybody off in church, ever. I've been accused of a lot of things. I've wanted to, but anyway. And also, I mean...
Nobody will believe him ever.
Yeah, well. And the other thing, too, is I think, Sarah, what I appreciate about your book and also just what you said here, and I think this is so important for people to keep hearing again and again and again, that it is normal to go through a process of not knowing what the heck's going on. It's normal to have faith crises. I think evolving faith is a great metaphor for that. You don't know where it's going, unless you don't like evolution. Who here is pro-evolution? Who believes in it? On that side, the other one's on that side. We'll see how this works out later. Anyway, But I think it's a good metaphor because it's something that it's like a force that changes you, and I think that force is the Spirit of God that changes you.
Yeah.
And with all the messiness and all the other stuff that happens,
Yeah.
you know, it's the normal part of faith that
Yeah.
the man doesn't want you to know. That sounds like a horrible '60s thing to say, but it's true. You know, the system works well with people just playing on the beach blanket and getting along. But the questions come, and it's hard sometimes to define people, you know, communities involving faith.
Yep. I think that's part of
yeah.
maybe some of the exhale that
Yeah.
we need, right? Is just, I think sometimes, especially if you came up in certain, you know, religious communities or spaces or contexts where even the normal experiences of being a person are almost like pathologized.
Right.
Right? Or the sense of like, well, you know, if you did this better, you wouldn't have landed here. And then all of a sudden you look around and realize, well, that's kind of most of us.
Right.
You know, it's not always as spectacular and overdramatic as mine.
Right.
I mean, a lot of mine I felt was it felt like a bit of a thicket. I don't know if you all have had this experience where it's not just one thing that you can point to and be like, yeah, this is worth upending my whole life over. But it's like 16 or 17 different things, and then suddenly there'll be like a moment where you're like, well, I guess that's that then. Like I can't unsee what I've seen, I can't unknow what I know, like whatever else it is. And there were a lot of personal things that led me down that path, and yet one of the things that I have felt has been a real connection point for a lot of folks with your story has been the fact that it was actually the Bible that messed you up.
Well, I'd like to think of it now, it's not really the Bible, it's people's expectations and how it's supposed to work, and then they tell you to read it. How many of you were told to read your Bible every day?
Yeah.
And then you did, right? It's like you can't get out of Genesis 2 and say, hold on. These things don't line up very well, and all this stuff's happening, so, but yeah, I mean, and I found that to be very common that for a lot of people who are in this process of evolving or adapting or deconstructing, whatever word we want to use, a lot of it for us began with the Bible. And it might be very specific things or just like, I don't relate to this. Like, I don't have a cow that goes into somebody else's field and I don't know what to do about that, right? But it's not to make light of it, right? It's just not to have those expectations that this is going to be the answer book for our lives. When in fact, within the Bible itself, to me, this is one of the beautiful gifts of the Bible. It's like they're arguing with each other.
Yeah.
That is a beautiful thing in our sacred text. It isn't like a pamphlet, right? It's different perspectives that are being, I think, true to their humanity, having integrity and disagreeing with other authors in places. And that may throw a wrench in the system, but it like students have said, it gives the humanity of the Bible is very important to them, and it's attractive to them because it's human. I had a student years ago, just a very quick story here, who was sort of done with Jesus and the whole Bible thing. And in a class, I didn't teach the class, but she told me about this. She was learning about how the gospel writers don't agree with each other and how they tell stories differently, and some just tell different stories entirely. And she said, that is so interesting. They actually thought about what they were saying, and they were trying to say something, you know. And it was an adult appreciation for the book. And I mean, the Bible is not the problem. It's what we expect of it, you know. And I think that's what a lot of people struggle with when it comes to the Bible. It is a messy book. It's ancient, right? I mean, the Bible goes back to, I mean, just depending who you ask, but, you know, at least 3,000 years ago, people were probably writing some things that were in the Bible. We're as far removed from that in time backwards as we're removed from the time 5,000. I mean, just think about that. It's like, oh, and this book's going to tell me what to do on every page. It's like, no, you're going to have to navigate it, negotiate with it. And that's what people have always done, you know. But we're not always taught that.
You talk a lot, though, about the role of wisdom in that. And I find that that's one of the things, I remember when I was reading Curveball, you talked about how you had almost abdicated that responsibility for your faith. Like one, and I would often say, like, you want to outsource the work of the Holy Spirit.
Right.
Like it's just easier if someone will just tell me, please,
It is easier,
what to do. It is.
Yeah.
It is easier. But then what is the role of wisdom and discernment? I think one of the things that I've often found with people is almost needing to like relearn how to discern well and relearn, or maybe learn for the first time even, what wisdom looks like.
Right. Well, I mean, wisdom, you can't like package it, right? I think
Damn it.
I know.
Okay.
I can. Give me $20. All of you give me money and I'll package wisdom for it. But I think that's part of, I think the wisdom of the Bible itself is that we see people saying, okay, in this context that I'm in, it could be the exile. It could be, the time of David. It could be the Exodus, whatever it is. At that time, they're saying, this is what it looks like for God to show up. And the question we have to ask is not how can we replicate the biblical stories in our lives, but we have to ask the same question. How do I think God is showing up in this situation, whether it's your family or just the life around you, work or whatever? And that's not something that comes easily.
No.
It's difficult, But it's difficult, but not in a hopeless sense. It's just, it's adulting, and we don't get the pamphlet to just sort of, here you go and everything's going to be fine. It can be a struggle to have faith, right? Can I get an amen from somebody out here, right? Yeah. Losers. I tricked you into that. No, faith's easy. I think the Bible then, to read it as a book of wisdom, that I then have to gain enough wisdom to know, how do I bring this into my existence? That's a journey for me that's worth taking. That is something worth doing. To just sort of line up with the expectations of how the Bible has to work, and if it doesn't work this way, it's not really the Word of God. Maybe what makes it the Word of God is how it acts in inspiring wisdom rather than just giving us simple answers. And anything, even, God is love. Do you believe that? Yeah, I believe it. I don't know what it means. Depends on what you mean by God. Right? Depends on what you mean by love. Frankly, it depends on what you mean by is. God is love. What does that mean? It's just, you have to figure that out the rest of your life. You'll be fine. Right? So.
One of the things I remember hearing really early in that process of trying to develop wisdom was around this idea of like looking for good fruit.
Yeah.
Right? And like you can tell, it's that story of like how Jesus said you can tell a tree by its fruit. And I think some of the things, maybe some of the reason why we struggle with wisdom and discernment is because many of us came from a religious context that would look at bad fruit or things that were causing harm and would say, well, that looks great right there. It's like that's the good fruit. Yeah. And if something is wrong or if it's causing harm, well, that's your problem. You're probably intolerant to the good fruit. Instead of actually questioning whether or not it was. And so I think that sometimes that's even where it began for me, with reading the Bible through the lens of like wisdom and understanding of like both place and time and context, and I'm still on this journey. There's this sense of like, where am I seeing good fruit? Where am I finding flourishing? Where am I finding truth and goodness and beauty, which feel like very big nouns and verbs to demand of ourselves right now. And yet oftentimes they can be hiding in very small ways and almost like that next right thing sort of decision making. And so sometimes it's even just that very first beginning of like, well, I don't think that's actually good fruit. I don't think it's causing flourishing. Right. I think that maybe there's something here that's actually a wisdom invitation or a discernment invitation. Maybe I have missed something here. If this thing that I believe is causing harm or this thing that I'm a part of is, even inadvertently, right? And without that intention,
Right. Yeah, I've heard, I think, not to get nerdy, this is a Protestant problem, really, because it's always, I've always heard the terms contending for the gospel, right?
I love that word, be careful.
And so you can, maybe you're part of the problem, Sarah.
I'm not part of the problem, I'm the whole
you are
problem.
The problem. I walked into that one, didn't I? All right. But, contending for the gospel, which really means defending a particular way of thinking about the gospel, right? And so this is Protestantism in a nutshell. I'm not really a Protestant. I don't know what I am right now. I think I'm Episcopalian.
You can be a problem with me.
Huh?
You can be a problem with me.
What's that? Our own denomination?
Yeah,
Okay.
absolutely.
The
I mean, that
problem
goes really well when people go start their own denominations.
I know, it always works out somehow.
Works out great every time.
It's never cultish or anything like that. It's really
Never.
great. But that's sort of Protestantism too, right? It's again, I'm not bashing Protestantism. I mean, that's my home, really. You know, I'm not Roman Catholic. I'm not Orthodox. But it's you can't. Love is the second thing you do. You have to get doctrine right first, right? And once you get then you get to love people, right? And so what they do sometimes, not everybody, but it has happened that you sort of burn people at the stake, metaphorically or literally, right? Because they have the wrong doctrine. And I remember asking, back when I taught seminary, asking a student of mine who was graduating, who was particularly adept at creating fires. I asked him, I said, you know, but where's the love? And he said to me, love? That's what the liberals say. So I don't know how to follow that up with the question, but that's the way it is. And yeah, I mean, I've come to see. I mean, I'm a slow learner. We all have our own journey, but how we treat other people, that's the most straightforward thing to do. It's also the easiest. I mean, the hardest thing to do, right? I mean, it's hard to do that. But if we just focused on that, if I just focused on that, life would be a lot better. Be a lot more Jesus-y, I think, right? And then you know what? In the midst of that, you can work out the mess, right? In the midst of walking that hope trail, I guess, the mess is always going to be there, and we can work it out. We can try to work it out in ways that make sense to us, and to have integrity while we do that. You know, I think God values our integrity. You know, I mean, what makes God happier? I can't speak for God, but what makes God happier? To leave church because it just doesn't make sense to you, or to stay there and just go, la, 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 I do not hear you, I'm just going to keep playing the church game, right? Can God exist outside of what places we're used to seeing God? I sure hope so. We have an infinite multiverse. I think God can handle this thing here, you know. And that's why I think integrity is very important too for all this whole process, which you've spoken of too. Even today it came out to me anyway. Yeah.
I think that's one of the things that kind of starts to unravel us, is that yearning for certainty. I really enjoyed how, I remember like your book title, The Sin of Certainty.
Yeah. How
that just almost felt like it was like setting the cat amongst the pigeons. Because that's not a word that you usually see put together
I know.
In that same way.
That's why I did it.
Said the lady who wrote Jesus Feminist.
Yeah, right.
Amateur hour over here.
No.
So I'm wondering...
Is this over yet?
Yeah.
This is getting a bit old right now. So.
I guess my question around that, though, is like when we think so much about how much emphasis has been placed on certainty, whether it's related to Scripture or whether it's related to our faith and how we embody that and move that through, what does it look like, or what are some of the ways that you can begin to kind of like, I don't know, release the death grip on that? Especially when it's kind of being like, well, the more certain you are, the more right you are, the more holy you are, the more faithful you are. And when you start to have that sense of uncertainty, I guess I'm wondering if there's a path towards that hopefulness within the uncertainty.
I can only speak for myself, and it's not easy, you know, because you're used to thinking that way. I mean, a lot of people just in their life of faith, it's really a matter of putting ideas together, right? I mean, that's me. I like ideas, and I like when they fit together nicely. And I see God that way. Big joke that is, right? But, you know, it's seeing everything meshed together is really nice. For me, I can only speak for myself, I had to get to a point where that no longer worked. What happened? A bunch of stuff, like not one thing, but like a lot of little things. All of a sudden, it's like, you know, the Jenga tower is starting to fall down a little bit. People keep pulling the things out, and all of a sudden, it's all over the table. And it took time. It does take time, you know.
Like you have to live into it.
You have to live, that's exactly right. You can't force anybody else into it, that's for sure, right? Except for my students, I force them into it all the time. Maddie, looking at you, Maddie. But you have to live into it, and then the thing is, it's hard to live into it because it's scary, you know. Very briefly, I had an experience. Just factually, I taught at Westminster Theological Seminary for 14 years. I was a student there beforehand, learned a lot. I have good memories from that. It just didn't end well. And when I left that place, I was the happiest human being who's ever lived, ever, for about the first 6 months. And then I had this creeping feeling inside, I'm not really sure what I believe anymore. Because that had been sort of curated for me for many, many years, signed the document and you're done, right? And I remember just staring out the window in my bedroom saying, I don't know if I believe anything anymore. And this little voice inside of me said, well, Pete, you didn't want anybody telling you what to think. You got what you asked for. Now what are you going to do? And I said, I have the slightest idea what I'm going to do now, right? And so I can only say that over the period of a couple years after, I didn't script anything. For me, I learned to let go of my head. That's really what it came down to learn to honor my head without living in it. And that meant all the ideas had to be taken away and I had to be left with nothing. And I built it back, but I didn't really build it back. It's different. You know, you talked about that too. It's you believe differently, you think differently. And for me, it's actually a bigger God in the process. Not the little one of my imagination. I mean, our imaginations are always involved in it, but that's limiting, right? Every once in a while, we have to be aware of how limiting our thinking is in terms of the reality of God. And that's why, you know, not being certain is not losing God, it's losing your dumb ideas about God. That worked for a while.
So true.
Right? They work.
Yeah.
But it's sometimes like, okay, are you ready? You've taken one step, there are like 8 million left to go. Let's keep walking here, right? That's sort of what happened to me, and that's the Sin of Certainty. That book came out of those experiences, you know. So all my books are journaling. They just don't know it.
Sounds familiar.
Yeah, right. I know.
Well, I think that's why a lot of us see ourselves there. I think one of the things that was almost a shift for me is realizing that I'm not the one person who's going to wander out of God's love.
Yeah, right.
Or that somehow the love of God is kind and patient, and yet somehow not kind and patient with me.
Right.
And like somehow it was always dependent on my right thinking and my right opinions. But everybody else, that wasn't the case. I genuinely believed that God would love them.
Right.
But for me, I didn't think that qualified. So even that sense of like letting yourself have it embodied, letting yourself actually believe or dare to believe for, that as kind of the foundation, I think almost gives you some room to play.
Well, how did you get there, though? I mean, how did you get to that point where you could accept that God still loves you? Well,
being Protestant, a lot of it was rooted in Scripture. And then being charismatic, it was also sloppy and experiential. So both of those things were true.
Yeah. Whatever it takes. Right?
Whatever it takes. Whatever it takes. I was not picky or choosy. I was going to take anything and everything. So, I mean, I think that some of the other places where I ended up almost being able to find it was through the translation of friends and people around me.
Yeah, absolutely.
I know in the years when I felt like I lost prayer, for instance, I'd grown up knowing one particular way to pray, lost that very spectacularly, and felt like maybe I didn't know how to pray anymore. I didn't even, and finding that I could rest in the prayers of others, that could hold me for a while, learning there were options and almost resting places, scaffolding maybe, even to kind of hold me up like a trellis. It let love and hope and faith begin to kind of grow until they were sturdy enough almost on their own. Right. And so I think that's one of the things that maybe is one of the reasons why I'm always a little wobbly when I talk about hope right now. And one of the things I want to talk about later on this week with the folks at Eastern is like some very existential questions I've asked myself, going to your point about journaling, like, is this enough?
Right.
Is hope and love enough at this moment in time? And I think that's where a lot of even the practices in Field Notes for the Wilderness came from, is saying, these are the things I actually do to cultivate hope. These are the things I'm doing to kind of cultivate that sort of, love and joy and peace and kindness and goodness and faithfulness and gentleness and even, I hope, someday self-control. And I have been amazed. Oh, I bet you are. I think one of the things I remember reading in Curveball was you talking a lot about how that the glory of God is not just shouting at us from the cosmos, that it's in all of these moments in our lives. And that has been true for me and been a huge part of what healing has looked like and a huge part of what wholeness and embodiment has looked like. It's been so much more humble and ordinary than I would have ever imagined, and so much more daily. And so when I'm thinking about, as you're walking this out and you're a companion to so many students who are often coming to you at very different places from very different backgrounds. I know I made the joke earlier that, when you had your certainties blown to hell, it was God that held the match. Some people might say that Pete Enns held the match for him. I don't know. It's a sacred privilege
I'm just
to
the
blow
messenger,
up. Yeah,
that's
exactly.
all,
So I guess my question to you, as I know we need to start wrapping up, but I wanted to ask you, what are some of, okay, I'll say it this way. There's no part of me anymore that thinks that there's 6 steps to like cracking the code on this. Right? Or that, here's, you lost all your answers and all your certainties, and so here's a nice new tidy set. Come and take these, right?
Yeah.
Because then you just turn into a different kind of fundamentalist. It's unpleasant. And then you join Twitter. Speaking from experience. You pick fights with the Gospel Coalition, it's great. But so you end up in this place, and so I think that the thing I'm interested in is that discernment and wisdom and embodiment and healing kind of work that is so humble and is so ordinary and is so practiced. And I like the word practices because it implies we don't have it figured out yet, that it is a thing that we are working out in real time in our actual lives. And so the ones that worked for me that I put in the book wouldn't necessarily be everybody's, right? And so in a lot of ways, it's even clearing the path enough to say, this is what worked for me, take what works, and maybe not all of it will. You and I are very different people. And so what were some of the practices that you use or that you kind of can point to and say, this helped cultivate love in me, this helped cultivate hope in me, even when maybe it looked so ordinary?
Yeah, I'm thinking of Richard Rohr, who says, you come to certain places because of pain, right? And so, everybody has pain in their lives. We all address it differently. But for me, a way of cultivating hope has been, I think, and they're ongoing. It's like, I did this a year ago, and now I'm great. Yeah, it's not that kind of, it's just like, I don't want to do this, but I know it's good for me. Being a part of a liturgical context where I don't have to make the words up. I still, when I tend to, begin classes with a prayer from the Book of Common Prayer, which they hate, but I don't care, because they're going to get anyway. It's good for you. I don't understand it. I don't care. Just listen to it, right? These are great words, right? But the thing is that it's a process of putting my chatty brain away, right? And that's something that's very hard to cultivate for somebody who talks for a living and only thinks. A lot of people are wired that way. It's not college professors, just people, or a lot of people are just wired that way, right? And so I think as a result of some of those things, I'm well into the second half of life now, and I'm just so comfortable with not having final answers and things. You just get to that point. It's like, I'm just tired. I'm just so sick and tired of like having, I don't know what's going on anymore, you know. And part of that for me too is, you know, something I'm a little uneasy even mentioning because I'm like so bad at it. But praying in silence. Anybody do that already? Am I just like, yeah, it's like the worst thing experience ever. Close your eyes.
Great advertisement.
Pick your word that you keep coming back to every time you have a thought. Well, then the word's popping up every 2 seconds because, you know, the thought's over there. But the thing is that it's getting a little bit more tolerable as time goes by, right? And I think, I know this about myself. I need to do that. I need to find a way to not always have a thought be the first thing that enters my life, just to sort of be still. And there are people who have helped me with that a lot, whether they're books or just real life people who understand this very, very well. So to me, that's hopeful. You see, it's the hope because it takes away my need to have everything sort of make sense, right? And I just sort of live. And then I can focus on really just thinking, how can I be a kind person today? That's another new thing for me too, by the way, folks. Right? So, you know, it's just, those to me are hopeful practices.
Yeah.
You know, it's not going to change the world. It's not going to determine the election in a few months. But it's going to give me a sense of just hope for my own humanity, my own place in this whole human drama. With God, right? Who I don't control, who's telling me to shut up every once in a while. So, yeah, there you go.
There you go.
Yeah.
I think that's one of the things that there's something very holy about finally letting yourself say, I don't know.
Yeah.
Right? Because it's almost like that integrity
Yes.
you know, just not pretending and performing and being the dancing bear, right? And so I think there's something really invitational about the altar of, I don't know, and letting that be enough for a little while. I think one other thing that I have found really helpful in that same line, I struggle with the idea of loving things in general. You know, like love the world and whatever else. And I remember, like, there was no part of me that really wanted to get married and like have a family, really. Like, I just never really entered my head. I quit babysitting at 14 because I figured there had to be a better way to make money than that. And yet then I met Brian. And all I wanted to do was marry him. I didn't want to get married in general. I wanted to like run down a chapel aisle and marry him. And I still feel like that. And so this in particular is what I want. And so that almost kind of made me feel like there's a path here for me, even within the I don't knows, of moving from generalities to particularities. I don't know if I can love the whole church right now, because we're a hot mess. But I love these people, and I love this particular place, and this little youth group that loves my kids. And they make icons, and my son picks Johnny Cash. So either I'm winning as a parent or not, depending
You're nailing
on
it, or yeah, right.
And I have felt very similarly about the act of hope, or the act of showing up to the questions of our time and being able to rise to this moment collectively, but also being able to be in relationship with people and be able to be in relationship with the world, meaning like actually like our place in it. There's something, I don't know if I can love the whole world, but I do know I can love these things in particular, and I am happy to consent to that breaking my heart. Because it probably will. And even consenting to that kind of devastation from a place of particularity, it has been a path of goodness.
Right.
It has mean that you have this almost sacramental habit of noticing what's beautiful in the person beside you, what's beautiful in the people that you live with, of looking back over your own life and loving the kid you were.
Right.
Loving all the versions of yourself who needed some of those things that now you make fun of. Don't make fun of those things. You loved them then.
Yeah.
Right? And so I think there's an element of invitation and altar to that sort of particularity in the moments when we most feel disoriented and not knowing what next. I've found at least a small path through the wilderness there.
Right. Yeah, I always think here, not to get preachy, but
Oh, please do. I
1
love
John
preaching.
4, whatever verse it is, I forget, but no one has ever seen God. But if we love one another,
Right.
And I think that is that concreteness of being in community. It's an overused term, but it's a good one, right? I need people. I need
Yeah.
people around me. I need just to be there. You know, that's why I like going to church. Oddly enough, I always hated going to church most of my life, but things have clicked the past few years with me. I feel there's an integrity for me to be doing that. But it's the people there, and that means a lot to me. You know,
Yeah.
who loves the world?
This is the
Come
question.
on, Sarah, just get off your high horse.
This is the question.
It's not even an option. Like, how do you love the world?
I feel like I'm almost there. I do.
I love my cat. I know, you're getting there. Good for you, yeah. Yeah.
Anyway, thank you so much for
Yeah.
being up here and
Thank
being in
you, Sarah.
conversation.
Thank you very
I love
much.
you.
Yeah, love you.
All right, thanks everyone.